Okay, hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Peloponnesian War, which was a devastating, really civil war between the Athenians and their allies and the Spartans and their allies. And if you remember last time we talked about the Persian Wars and how Athens was claiming that it really was the main victor in the Persian Wars, and Sparta claimed that they were as well. This led to a lot of different tensions, which ultimately led to this war. Now, when we're talking about sources, we actually have a really interesting book called The History of the Peloponnesian War by a man named Thucydides. Um, Thucydides was a general in this war, so it's really some of the first-hand accounts of these particular battles and what was happening. I'll talk about Thucydides a little bit later. If you remember, we talked about the Hellenic League that was put together to defend against Persia. Now, what I'm going to do is give you a little rundown of some more of the tensions that are happening between Athens and Sparta. And Pericles, remember we talked about him last time, he canceled the Hellenic League in 461 BC. And if you remember, I also mentioned a little bit about Cimon, who was pro-Spartan during this period. He was exiled in 461, so he was ostracized and had to leave the city. And again, that was because of his pro-Spartan views. And then there were a number of things that start to happen fairly quickly. So between 460 and 454 BC, you've got a lot of battles happening between Athens and Sparta. And one thing that Athens did that really made Sparta mad was they created an alliance with Argos. And I'm hoping you have your geography book in front of you. I should have put a map here where Argos was. But Argos is northeast of Sparta in the Peloponnese. And so when Athens created an alliance with that, Sparta got really nervous and wondered why Athens would be doing that. And we talked about Sparta having trouble with the Helots before. Now in 460, there was an uprising of the Helots, excuse me, and this time the Spartans sort of won. I don't know if that's really the right word for it, but the Helots surrendered and they were permitted to leave parts of Sparta. And so what happened here, and again, this is another bitter point between Athens and Sparta, the Athenians ended up helping settle the Helots near the Gulf of Corinth. Now, Corinth is a city-state we haven't really talked about, but it had been allied with Sparta for quite a while and really did not like the Athenians. And so now you've got the Athenians settling a bunch of Helots near their city-state. So they were mad about that. And then you have some battles between the Athenians and the Spartans and Thebes in 457, where you've got the Athenians being defeated by Sparta. But then after the Spartans leave, the Athenians defeat the Thebes, one of the allies with the Spartans. So lots of little battles going on, lots of tension building up. In 451, so 10 years after he was exiled, Cimon was allowed to come back. And remember, he was pro-Spartan. So what he ended up doing is creating a 5-year peace with Sparta. And in part of that agreement, the alliance with Argos was canceled. So that made Sparta feel better. A few years after that, they signed a 30-year truce, which didn't last that long. But anyways, Athens also recognized the independence of Argos. Argos was really a sore spot for them. Now, one thing really interesting, I'll show you this on the map in the next slide, is that the Athenians set up a colony in a place called Amphipolis. And let me show you where that is. So you can see the red line. Let me get my highlighter out. So Athens is down here. You can see where Amphipolis is. Now, Amphipolis is a great site to found a colony because what it does is it gave Athens access to all the natural resources up above. And so lumber, metals, and so on. So it was a nice place to create a city-state. And this is going to cause tension later, obviously. So remember we talked about the Delian League. This was set up by Athens to supposedly protect Greece from Persian incursions. And so by now you've got over 200 city-states. And remember that they had to pay dues, which was either money or ships. And most of them paid money. And if you remember, the it's called the Delian League because the treasury was on the island of Delos. And that was brought back to Athens, and we talked about this last time, that really helped fund the whole classical period. So you've got 200 members, they divided it up into 4 areas. Now, what's really interesting, and this causes lots of issues within these city-states that were in the Delian League, is that the Athenians forced them to use their own weights and measures. So sometimes that wasn't an issue where you've got different city-states having different weights. For example, a pound somewhere, like what we might call a pound, might be 3/4 of a pound or a pound and a half. Athens said, no, all the weights and measures must follow what Athens is doing. If there were any serious issues, legal issues like murder and so on, those would all have to be dealt with in Athenian law courts, which is really interesting. So what you can see here is these Delian League members are starting to lose their ability to be independent. And Athens also dominated foreign trade. So these city-states in the Delian League couldn't make their own trade deals with others without permission from Athens. And another thing that Athens did, which made a lot of city-states mad, is something called a klerouchi. And these were military outposts put in places that the Athenians thought would cause issues. And of course, this did not make these city-states very happy. And then here's just a map showing you the extent of Athenian control, and that's in yellow. So they controlled a lot, of course, all the city-states bound around the Aegean Sea, and so on. So they were fairly large. Now, there are really 3 episodes that started the official Peloponnesian War. So if you read about the Peloponnesian War, you see, and I just talked about this, things starting to happen around 460 BC that lead up to the actual war. So there's 3 episodes I just want to go through really quickly. So there was a city-state called Epidamnus, and it was founded by Corcyra. So you can see on the arrow on the map where I'm pointing towards Corcyra. Epidamnus was set up. Now Corcyra, the mother city, was actually a colony of Corinth. And remember, I just told you that Athens and Corinth didn't get along. So Epidamnus was founded by Corcyra, and Corinth didn't really like this because they felt they were being disrespected by both Corcyra and Epidamnus. So Corcyra tried to allay the fears of Corinth, and it didn't work. And so Corinth went to war with Corcyra. Now, the Athenians were asked to get involved in this. There was a little bit of hesitation, and then the Athenians decided to go on the side of Corcyra. And what eventually happened is that Corcyra, even though they were a smaller city-state, drove out the Corinthians in a very famous naval battle. And of course, this created a lot of tension between Corinth and the Athenians. And Corcyra becomes under the control of the Athenians after this. Now, the Athenians also got involved in another Corinthian colony called Petidia. And again, I've put an arrow where Petidia is. Now, this has an interesting history because Petidia was technically part of the Delian League. And so they paid their dues to Athens. Now, the issue, though, was Petidia was created by Corinth. Athens was feeling, in 432, like Petidia was going to go on the side of the Spartans. And so they made a large number of demands that Petidia were supposed to follow. So for example, there were Corinthian judges or magistrates that were helping to run the city-state of Petidia. And Athens said that these judges had to leave. They also told Petidia that they have to tear down their defensive walls. So this was sort of to make sure that they were defenseless, essentially, against the Athenians if they decided to take over the city-state. Now, what really happened is that the Petidians refused all of this. They said the judges could stay, they weren't tearing down their walls, and then Athens attacked the city-state. Now, Corinth didn't like this because it was a colony of theirs, and Athens did it because they said it was part of the Delian League, and they weren't following the rules of being in the Delian League. So that was the second thing that happened to lead to the Peloponnesian War. And the third was, you've got a city-state called Megara, and it was allied with Sparta. and very close to Corinth. And so what happened is there were lots of issues between Megara and Athens. And Athens eventually issued something called the Megarian Decree in 432. And what that said is any no trade can happen with any dealing league member in Megara, which of course was a big financial blow against Megara and all the other local city-states, especially Corinth. And so this was finally really the last straw. Now I showed you that map about how big the Delian League or how big the Athenian Empire was, and this was quite a blow against Megara. This broke the 30-year truce, and then the war eventually started. Now, I don't want to talk too much about the war itself, except to just sort of set up what was happening. So I just showed you the map. Athens controlled a massive amount of territory. It didn't have a lot of support on the mainland. A lot of the mainland support was towards Sparta, but it did have a lot of money, and that was because of the Delian League. So you have Sparta. Now they had a massive land army. However, they didn't have a lot of military. And what they ended up doing is, or sorry, they had a lot of, they didn't have a lot of money, but had a massive army. And what they did, because they didn't have a lot of money, is they asked Persia for money, and Persia was happy to funnel money into causing issues, any type of issues, into Greece. Anyway, towards the very beginning, you have a typhus outbreak. And this was happening in Athens in 430 to 427 BC, and Pericles actually died of typhus. So this really weakened Athens during this time. Now, a few other things happened. So not everything was going badly for the Athenians. So for example, in 425, you've got ships landing at Pylos. I showed a few slides of Pylos at the very beginning of the course. It's this, the arrow in the south of the map. So what had happened was the Athenians had some ships sort of crash near an island of Pylos. The Spartans sent some of their military there, and they lost the battle. And so the Athenians captured about 420 Spartans. And this caused a lot of issues in Sparta because a lot of their men were now captured. And to make matters worse for the Delian League members, Cleon, who was the new sort of archon of Athens, raised the cost of being in the Delian League. So they were trying to raise more money. You've got another sort of famous battle during this period, 424 BC, where the Athenians were stopped at Megara and Boeotia, which is a little bit north of Athens, by a general called Brasidas. And Brasidas was very famous, and in the same year, he took his troops up to Amphipolis. And remember, this is the colony that Athens just started. This was taken by Brasidas as well, the Spartan general. Now, remember I told you Amphipolis was a very wealthy, or had access to a very wealthy area for the Athenians, and that was then cut off. So all that natural wealth, natural resources from Amphipolis was cut off from Athens. And now Thucydides, remember he was the one who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. He was the leading general who was supposed to be defending Amphipolis. And so the Spartans come in and take it. The Athenians government gets upset at Thucydides and they exile him. And what he does is he leaves and he goes off and writes the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is very fair to Athens, by the way, which is interesting considering what they did to him. Okay, I just want to spend a few minutes on the second phase of the war, and I really want to concentrate on Syracuse. I hope you can see my highlighter here. It's in the really southeastern part of Sicily. So what happened here, and this map is just showing you the relationship between where Greece, where Athens and Sparta and their allies are compared to Sicily. So what had happened is Sicily was really pro-Athens, and they asked the Athenians for help when some local city-states were rising up against them. So you've got some debate in Athens about whether they should be sending a military all the way into Sicily, and they decided to. So you've got Nicias, you've got Alcibiades, who I've talked about, and Lamachus was another general, which I haven't mentioned yet. They were generals. It was decided that Athens was going to send a massive naval army to defend Syracuse. So 27,000 Athenians were set to sail. Now, what's really interesting is just before this happened, the Herms. Now, remember I showed you a statue of the Herm. It was that sort of naked male figure. These were considered to be religious statues. A lot of those were broken soon after they decided to go to Syracuse, and it was decided that this was a sign of bad luck. Alcibiades was threatened with being put on trial for religious crimes. And Alcibiades wanted to be put on trial before he left because he was leading the navy, so that he wouldn't have to be worried about this. And they decided that they would put him on trial later. So he goes off with 27,000 sailors. Now, when he gets to Syracuse, the Athenians call him back and tell him he's going to be put on trial now. Now, Alcibiades does something really kind of terrible in the history of the Peloponnesian War. He leaves Athens and he goes to the Spartan side. And he starts feeding advice to the Spartans. And one thing he tells them to do is to block Syracuse. And what this does is it causes a lot of the Athenians, soldiers who were there, to be captured. And so they really lost this first part where 27,000 men were sent over. In 413, Athens decides to send another 25,000 men from Athens to Sicily. Now, this was a disaster, so that they land, they start to fight. It's decided that things are going so poorly they had to leave. Now, what had happened, though, is Nicias, who was the general, didn't want to leave right away because there was going to be a full moon, and he figured that would be a bad omen. Now, he waited till after, he wanted to wait till after the full moon was done, and in the meantime, the Spartans brought over some of their allies, and they blockaded Syracuse again. What this did was that meant that the Athenians were trapped. A lot of them were captured and sold into slavery, and it was a massive debacle, really. And Nicias ended up being executed. By 413, Athens was really falling apart. They didn't really have a democracy anymore. It was controlled by 10 men, and they increased the taxes on the dealing leagues. So what they started to do is they taxed everything that was going in and everything that was going out into these city-states so that they can raise money. Now, also in 412, you've got Persia sending money. Now, the Persian money didn't come just because they felt like it. They wanted control of Ionia, and Sparta said yes. And then in 412, 411, you've got BC, many of the Delian League city-states were in open revolt against Athens. So it was going pretty terribly. And in the end, you've got the fall of democracy. So the Athenians asked Alcibiades, who had gone to the Spartan side, to come back and control the Athenian fleet, and he said yes. In 410, you've got democracy being restored. Now, Alcibiades was in trouble again, and he fled to the Hellespont. If you remember, that's the mouth that leads into the Black Sea. You've got another very famous Spartan general called Lysander. What he ends up doing is forming an alliance with Persia. He takes a fleet, he sails up into the Aegean Sea, and he starts attacking the various city-states that belong to the Delian League. And what he ended up doing is forcing them out, forcing the people out of their city-states. And what they decided to do is flee to Athens. And Lysander was really encouraging this. So Athens is having lots of trouble. They just got over typhus. They're losing a lot of the natural resources that feed the city. And here you've got Lysander pushing all of these Delian League people into Athens. And this really caused the collapse of Athens. It just couldn't handle that. And Athens was defeated in 404. Some of the allies of Sparta wanted Athens destroyed. So Corinth, no big surprise, they always hated Athens. And Thebes wanted it destroyed, and Sparta said, no, we're not destroying it. But there were terms of submission, and I list them here. So the long walls, and I talked about these walls being built that were built between Athens and the Piraeus, which was their port. These had to be destroyed. The walls surrounding Athens had to be destroyed. All their navy, except for 12 triremes, had to be given up. The Delian League was dissolved, and they had to become a subject ally to Sparta. So this is how the Peloponnesian War ended, with the total defeat of Athens, and then being forced to become part of Sparta. Now, Athens fell apart pretty quickly after this. So you've got 30 people who take control of Athens. They're called the 30 tyrants because, and this is the bad version of tyranny, led by a man named Critias. Critias I'll talk about in just a second, but he was a student of Socrates, which causes issues for Socrates later. Anyway, you've got these terrible 30 people ruling Athens, and Pausanias, the king of Sparta, decides that Athens was in such a bad shape, he wanted to restore democracy there to at least keep it going, because if it was an ally to Sparta, it would help to keep them at least a little bit stronger than totally falling apart and being ruled by tyrants. So he restored democracy in 403. The last slide I want to talk about is Socrates. So I just mentioned that, Critias was one of his pupils. He's also got the famous Plato, Xenophon. Another pupil was Charmides. Now, Socrates was put on trial in 399 BC, so a couple years after the end of the war. And it was really in revenge for what Critias and the 30 tyrants did. That's really the background to his whole trial. Now, he was tried for a number of things, including corrupting the youth, which of course was was his direct involvement with Critias. And you probably know the outcome of this. He was found guilty. There was some talk that they would exile him, ostracize Socrates, but they decided that, or he really decided himself, to drink hemlock, which was suicide. So he committed suicide at the end of the Peloponnesian War after Sparta had taken control. Now, I'm going to stop here. Next week, we will look at what happens to Greece in the 300s BC. And as I'll give you just a little hint of what's going to happen, it's going to really totally fall apart, and it's going to open the way for Greece to be taken over by Alexander the Great.